Now I'd like to welcome to the show Gabriella Hoffman, Director of the Center for Energy and Conservation at the Independent Women's Forum. Welcome to Free the Economy, Gabriella.
Good to be on, Richard, and big fan of what CEI does. And we are very happy to partner with you guys on these environmental issues.
Oh, great. Thank you. And so, first up, I recently interviewed Dominic Pino of National Review, and I asked him about several members of Trump's new cabinet. And he said his personal favorite so far was Secretary of Energy Chris Wright. He's a big Chris Wright fan. Uh, how would you grade the Trump 47 energy policy agenda so far?
Well, there are three particular cabinet secretaries, one of them being EPA Administrator Zeldin. They don't call it secretary, they call it administrator. But I would say so far, overall, I'd probably give them an A minus maybe for Secretary Burgum because I like what he's doing. I don't like a recent proposal to put affordable housing on public lands. It's the only thing kicker I have. But overall, I would say that but I admire them rather, to be more objective, steering away from this net zero posturing we saw from the Biden administration to this posturing and notion of energy abundance, prioritizing obviously reliable energy over intermittent, unreliable energy. And that could also lead to a simultaneous promotion or conservation of natural resources, the environment. And so seeing a balance restored, especially through government notions, is very encouraging. So I would say they're largely doing good. And I know they want to go at rapid speed to push more. We see obviously more LNG terminals being approved by Secretary Wright at DOE. We see Zeldin trying to clean house with all these crazy, green spending. Burgum is trying to unleash energy and also kind of restore some balance at some of the related land agencies, Fish and Wildlife Service, Bureau of Land Management. There still are a few outstanding directors, BLM, Fish and Wildlife Service, and others that still need to be approved. So they're doing great on energy. They have more to do on land, but I hope they don't really go forward with the affordable housing on federal lands. I think there's another way to go about that issue rather than doing that. I think just stick with multiple use management. But I would say for energy, absolutely very, very excited. And our center is eager to work with them. And we've begun to try to partner with them and influence them. And much like CEI has to steer them in the right direction. But yeah, I would say A minus so far.
All right. So, I noticed your title includes words energy and conservation, and you talk about natural resources and including like wildlife and things like that. But that doesn't necessarily mean you identify as an environmentalist or an environmental activist.
No.
What is that? What do those terms mean to you?
Yeah, I think what we see in terms of, well, the left has really hijacked conservation. I've been very adamant about trying to make a distinction between what the left's view of conservation is versus what a center right or a conservative view of conservation is. And I think that term has to be taken back. And I hope I'm helping to lead the charge to do that for the past few years. I'm not the only one, but I've been very vocal about it, unabashed about it. And I see others now finally trying to take that term back as well. So hopefully leading something there. But you have to make the distinction between mainstream environmentalism or what they perceive as conservation versus actual conservation or true conservation versus kind of a preservation, rewilding, climate centric environmentalism. And what has largely dominated the environmental conversation is this emphasis on climate over conservation. And when you have this overemphasis rather, on climate, you don't really get conservation. You just get top down government policies. You get all this crazy spending, and you don't see any conservation of the environment as cost of living goes up with all these, different programs that make conventional energy, whether it's the extraction of it or even household appliances and derivatives that come from oil and gas byproducts and even other energy sources. The emphasis on climate is really, I think, what has done a number negatively to conservation. And conservation is the wise use of natural resources. That means not no use. It means that they just have to be stewarded very responsibly. And so they've been able to twist and contort what conservation is, which is why when we were deciding the name of our center 2 years ago, after we launched, we thought the conservation component has to actually represent conservation, not this climate centric, net zero, preservationist, return everything back to pre-settlement, kind of notion. That's what environmentalism has become. And so we're trying to do at the center is to showcase that conservation can be done simultaneously with more energy development, or I would say a tactful approach to energy development, not keeping things in the ground. And so I'm a hunter and angler. And so for me, conservation is a very personal matter. I truly believe in it. I hate that the term has been hijacked. So we also try to showcase that many people who work in energy also partake in these outdoor activities. They are conservationists oftentimes. They don't have to trade their livelihoods for the recreational pursuits. They can do both. And having a occupation that allows them to have a steady flow of income allows them to pursue opportunities in the great outdoors. It's not an either or situation. And so I think a conversation we on the right or center right have tried to have is, what does conservation actually mean? Does it mean no energy projects? Does it mean good, reliable energy projects at no detriment to the environment? And I think we're going in the right direction, thankfully. Our center is trying to help lead that conversation. I know CEI has talked about it. All the other groups that I think are in our orbit have tried to say that we can't have conservation without this shrugging of responsibility of having energy development that allows us to continue to be prosperous, innovative, export our energy to our allies, and have plenty of resources here at home. So we can have that position without being in towing with the left. And I think that's what our center is hoping to do. And I'm glad to see other conservative entities working on this as well.
All right, excellent. I know. So you sort of hinted at this where I'm about to go next when in question of reliable versus intermittent energy. But if we look back 20, 25 years since about at least the George W. Bush administration, it's been common for people on the sort of center right and in large parts, except for the like extreme left wing of the policy spectrum, to say that we need all of the above energy policy. That we shouldn't exclude oil and gas, but we shouldn't exclude wind and solar either, and that we should put everything on the table. But I noticed at the end of I think it was the end of last year, you and our episode 45 guest Andre Beliveau wrote an op-ed about this, and you said we should ditch this all of the above approach and talking points. Why?
It's a very interesting premise that Andre and I posed, and we weren't the only ones to echo it. Actually, you see across this Trump administration posturing on the day one executive orders, you saw them also use this jargon too. I think through the influence of Chris Wright, and I believe one of my former colleagues at IW helped write some of those executive orders and may had seen some of the language we were testing out there and putting. And so I can't claim credit for that, but I think Secretary Wright has talked about this frequently, and he's now definitely dedicated speeches, public appearances, TV appearances to pushing out this reliable, abundant, secure rhetoric. And I guess Andre and I were on the cutting edge, rhetorically ahead of the new administration taking in, but we weren't the first to talk about this. Secretary Wright was. And we think it was a concession to net zero, because you now start to see, and we'll be working, in a more formal capacity with you guys at CEI to oppose any continuation of IRA green subsidies. But we still we see some Republicans using that all of the above rhetoric. And some of them who use it still are wanting to keep some of those IRA sponsored projects in their districts, even if they didn't vote for the IRA when it was presented and signed into law by President Biden almost 3 years ago, 2.5 years ago. And so we believe that it's a concession to elevating and propping up unreliable energy sources when you say that. And when you make the distinction and say reliable energy, it plays better. It's more palatable, I would say, to an energy abundance agenda, because if you're propping up reliable and unreliable energy, could be unreliable energy like solar and wind, which sound great, and if you have storage, potentially could work. But because they're very expensive to shore up, they require subsidies, and they don't work nearly 90% of the time like nuclear and some other sources do. Is it really going to undermine your agenda? And that's what Andre and I concluded, that if language is very powerful. And if you're, saying all of the above and then it's not delivering, especially dispatchable, reliable energy, and you have problems when you put shocks in the grid with this unreliable energy, or the solar and wind don't work as intended if there's any blackouts, brownouts, or any weather interruptions. You don't want to have an energy policy that props up things. And that isn't to say maybe in some places you could have solar and wind, maybe in small particular areas, but to have them fully catalyzed, we've seen that doesn't work. And the industries that are bolstered by these so-called technologies, they haven't been able to work even without the subsidies that have backed them through this very, very expensive law. And we see that if the IRA is further perpetuated and potentially codified, not that we expect to see a Republican-led Congress codify the IRA, but the cost of the IRA green subsidies are expected to balloon. I think from a recent paper, excuse me, I think close to $2 to $4 trillion, a little over $4 trillion. So they're very expensive. They don't really work in terms of market innovation or prompting the market to invite these technologies. The market actually responds very negatively to subsidies. This has been tried across the Obama administration. Wasn't really in Trump 1.0. Biden very much supercharged these subsidies to go. And what we saw, coincidentally and ironically, is as more subsidies went to solar, wind, battery projects, we saw a lot of those industries collapse. Rooftop solar filed for bankruptcy. One of the biggest providers filed for bankruptcy. Wind energy, especially one of the major providers, Ørsted from Denmark, lost 83% of their market value across the 4 years. If you look at when Biden started versus when Biden ended. So they lost 83% of market share because offshore wind is not very profitable and it's actually not so good for the environment either. And so for us, when you're elevating these kind of untested, expensive, feel good sounding energy technologies and they don't work or they're very expensive to shore up and they don't lead to a reduction of your energy costs, even when subsidized, you have to kind of say, okay, maybe we need to reevaluate and maybe put these on the back burner, allow them, privately to occur where people want them. And I think even for oil and gas too, I don't think most of us support subsidies for oil and gas, and I don't think they're using it as much these days. Maybe decades ago they were reliant on it, but I don't know of any energy source that should be wholly subsidized. I think even nuclear too. Nuclear is still kind of held back because of high exorbitant costs, since the market has been very unfriendly to it, not because it's a bad technology, but investors have been misled about what it does. And so people have said that, nuclear, which is the most reliable actual clean energy source out there, starting to get its due. If it can be fully unleashed and kind of unburdened by red tape, it could fully unleash, the cost will go down and more people will like it when they see the benefits. So nobody wants subsidies to it, and everything has to be on an equal playing field. And so that's why we think reliable, going back to your original point, the reliable, abundant, secure jargon that we now see echoed across this administration government wide welcomes more market innovation, is not picking winners and losers, is kind of correcting the excesses and the mistakes of the previous administration. And more people, and even corporations that have been really big onto the climate posturing, the net zero posturing, have even changed their rhetoric too. So everything flows from, what the guidance of the federal government, and the federal government is saying, we want the market to reward technologies that work. We're going to elevate technologies, approve projects that are not going to be a cost to the taxpayer or ratepayer, that actually work most of the time.
All right. Uh, that sounds like an agenda right there. So, when it comes to energy abundance that we're talking about here, we talk about needing, having forecasts saying that we're going to need so many barrels of oil, so many cubic feet of natural gas, or so many megawatts of electrical generating capacity to meet our future needs. Energy is really sort of the master resource in the economy that allows us to sort of make productive use of everything else. But it's not the only thing we're going to need for abundance and sort of in our industrial economy. We have these mineral and resource inputs, things like nickel, cobalt, graphite, lithium, the rare earth minerals like neodymium and others. And I wonder, how do you think, you talk about how we're going in a good position towards energy abundance at the national level, sort of policy wise. How do you think we're poised with legal and regulatory infrastructure when it comes to all of this other, the sort of hard minerals we're going to need, whether there's the sort of minerals that go into, some of those things are inputs to renewable energy projects and things like EV batteries, but some of them are inputs to all sorts of other traditional manufactured industrial
Mm-hmm.
stuff. How do you think we are when it comes to minerals in general, whether they're rare or critical or, rare earth?
There's an appetite to onshore them a lot more here at home. I think as we're talking today, I was informed that Secretary Wright and the Vice President and Mike Waltz are in Greenland to talk about minerals, potentially with Denmark and the Greenlanders. So that's very interesting that they've really kind of, banked on that. But also President Trump also just issued a executive order for the shoring up of more critical minerals here at home. And that reminds me of, or kind of goes back to certain projects that Biden had canceled, the Twin Metal Mine project in Minnesota, potentially some in Alaska. I believe there was the Ambler Road project too, that also kind of connects to different mining projects as well. And so they recognize that depending on countries that are not friendly to us, that have really bad environmental standards in comparison to ours. And especially the fact that China dominates and owns the majority of processing and refining and the extraction of critical minerals. So the whole world is wholly dependent on China to do this. And I think you're right in terms of the way that we're going to be doing it. I'm not necessarily thinking it's going to be for EVs or so-called renewables. I think it's more so going to be for computers, other derivatives from which you need critical minerals, and perhaps some energy infrastructure projects. And where I'm also encouraged, even with that executive order to kind of streamline things more, there was a course correction. I believe CEI had talked about this as well, and we're really encouraged by this with NEPA, in terms of reversing even as far back, excuse me, as Carter era rules for NEPA. So there's going to be a whole reorientation about how NEPA is going to be constructed, because the Trump administration, I guess, had concluded that it was not working as intended, even if you try through the process. And ideally, we want Congress to reform this because that's where NEPA came from. But they want to kind of influence Congress to say, okay, we're going to be reevaluating NEPA because it takes 7 to 10 years to approve an energy infrastructure project. That can also include mining. And even if you go through the hoops and you prove that the project will have no detriment to the environment, you still have environmentalists suing in perpetuity to prevent these projects from going online or ever even having excavation begin. And so I believe their thinking is that if we retool this, even going as far back as the origin of this will prompt Congress to act, modernize NEPA, and make sure that we are not held in this kind of red tape or this no man's land where you can never have any energy infrastructure project, excuse me, whether it's conventional, something as clean like nuclear. So the NEPA kind of hamstrings, excuse me, energy infrastructure projects, whether they're clean or they're conventional, what have you. And so taking a look at that and revisiting that and reassessing that is going to be, I think, very positive for more projects to be approved in a timely fashion. So it's not bogged down in the courts, and that you don't have these environmental groups just stopping even environmental progress from taking foot. Because when these projects are blocked or bogged down in the courts, then we're having to outsource our productivity to countries where they are not so restricted like we are. And that's really kind of foolhardy, where we're trying to be energy independent, yet we're leaning on other countries for critical minerals. That makes no sense. And if you claim to be environmentalist, you want to have those projects done here at home where we have a good labor force. We're not engaging in child slave labor. We're using good, I wouldn't say good regulations. I know all of us who are free market oriented, we're very skeptical of regulations, but I would say good standards, where anytime you develop, you also have to be mindful of, preserving your environmental surroundings, not having any runoff, because that's costly to the company that is doing these projects. They don't want to have that. They don't want to be sued. So they're very particular about how they go about projects. And so doing everything here at home has net benefits to the economy, to environmental progress, innovation, and ultimately to the environment, because we're not importing dirty energy using slave labor. And we're obviously trying to keep that here at home and not be dependent. And so there's a net benefit to having this. And I think finally getting permitting reform that is robust, that is considering of shortening lengthy time periods for approval, and all the while making sure the environmental quality is preserved truly, not the interpretation that we had under Biden and most Democratic administrations. So we're very encouraged to see CEQ, NEPA, get restructured. So we'll see how that pans out. And if Congress has an appetite to actually pass some NEPA reform and permitting reform. There was a poll, I think, from Puck News that said that even 2/3 of congressional staffers were optimistic that meaningful permitting reform was going to happen. But that's really what's the missing piece. If you don't have permitting reform done, it's going to be impossible to get more projects approved. And then you'll see the Trump administration agenda held back. And we'll see more lagging behind countries like China, Russia, that are approving energy infrastructure projects. They don't do it in the same way we do. They're not as innovative. They're obviously more centrally planned economies than we are. And so we do things better. And the fact that we're having to play catch up to them when they do things a lot worse than us is a sad indictment. So we're hoping at our center, and I know all of the groups that we work with are hoping that meaningful permitting reform happens so we get actual progress and innovation done.
That's great. And I should just say for anyone who's not neck deep in all this stuff like you and I, Gabriella, NEPA is the National Environmental Policy Act from
Yes.
1970, which requires the government when technically this is a requirement on the government to do things rather than private parties to do things, but because private parties often need permits from the federal government, NEPA says before the federal government provides a permit, they have to run through the process of saying, oh, what will be the environmental impact of, such and such policy. Um, I've also thought NEPA would be a great name for a little baby girl. Wouldn't that be adorable, little NEPA?
It would be.
Um,
Yeah. And if I mention quickly, I didn't realize, or maybe I overlooked this in terms of permitting reform, but the states actually have an outsized role in this. So once the federal government gets their act together, states can do a lot more here too. So it's actually a responsibility of the states as well, like the federal government, to get more projects underway. So once that kind of block is no longer kneecapped, we will see the states be able to do their job too in improving more projects and working in cooperation with the government there.
Yeah, and I should give a shout out to my CI colleague, James Brule, who is a big state level regulatory reform expert. It's a wonderfully niche thing to be an expert in. And he's had a series of white papers that have rolled out over the past several months. Doing case studies on a bunch of different states. Virginia, for example, has done some great stuff recently. Um, so we can jump back a little bit about the question of kind of rhetoric and phrasing and framing. Previously we said going from on all of the above energy policy to reliable, affordable energy policy. Those two phrases obviously aren't mutually exclusive, but it's a difference in emphasis to say one rather than the other. And so, one sort of rhetorical construct that's bubbling up now that a lot of people are talking about is the idea of abundance and an abundance agenda. And a lot of people are talking about this new book by Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson called
Yeah.
Abundance, and applying that to public policy, saying the rules that govern the American economy should encourage abundance rather than restrict supply. And it sounds like you're pretty on board in general with that idea as a sort of like way of looking at the future. How do we talk about the future? Um, and so energy is certainly part of that, and it sort of goes downstream into things like, healthcare, transportation, higher education, all sorts of potential ways. Uh, how does that fit in with the idea, your general outlook, which is things like smaller government, less regulation, streamlined government operations? Um, is it possible to have sort of left of center people who like the idea of abundance kind of join hands with right of center people who like uh, small government as a way to get to abundance?
That's an interesting question you pose. And I had seen something and I actually responded to, or I quote tweeted Ezra Klein, who actually, funny enough, grew up a few towns over from me. He's a little older than me, but he's also from Orange County, California, which I find funny. And I applaud them for at least trying to engage in this issue of abundance. I disagree with his assessment. He was saying that we can have this, coming together of abundance. But one side is more bureaucratic and the other side is more authoritarian. And I reject that premise. I'm neither authoritarian nor bureaucratic. And I really think that to have abundance, you do have to be kind of a small government person. I don't think the federal government really should be ultimately deciding things. They're not the arbiter of business. They shouldn't be determining outcomes. They should just create a climate where abundance can be invited. You unshackle regulations, you get rid of red tape. Instead of them guaranteeing that, okay, we can guarantee abundance if we, add more regulations, more top-down approaches, which ultimately would not work. If you see, throughout history, top-down approaches don't work in any area. It makes things a lot more expensive. You lose your freedoms. There's more regulatory headache to deal with that. So yes, I think there could be a meeting of the minds, but I think they're going to have to nudge a little bit more into the being skeptical of government, central planning, especially because we see that that's what's creating all this inefficiency. I've never seen government work, even in friendly administrations. You don't really see this in Republican administrations, except for some sort of like, how would you say, like kind of nanny statism, if there is some nanny statism. But even Republicans are starting to recognize, and I think even this administration with their whole deal with tariffs, if you overregulate or you do something that goes against the free market, it just doesn't work, and you have to kind of reverse course. And so I think for this abundance mindset to work, you have to take government off the backs of people, individuals, businesses, and just let it flow and let it be unleashed and see what it does. It doesn't mean that it's going to be open season and there's going to be chaos. But if you trust the people, if you trust businesses, they're going to obviously, and individuals and businesses want to have incentives to not be penalized by the government. So they're going to make sure that any strategies that they employ, if they're constructing any energy infrastructure projects, it's not going to get you in trouble legally or invite some sort of fury from environmentalists. Not that you need to be worried about radical environmentalists, but they're going to go about things where if you're having energy projects in particular, maybe you're going to want to help restore a wetland that sits in close proximity to a nuclear facility or a natural gas plant because you just want to be considerate. Maybe people who work for the plant or would be plant are very invested in the community and don't want anything bad to happen. I'm not saying it's like ESG where you can artificially buy your good score and be in the good graces of the climate zealots. Um, but you would more so, I think a lot of people, what people don't know about those who work in energy projects is a lot of them, like I said earlier, they are heavily invested in their communities. They don't want to see any runoff, spillage, or any depletion or erosion of environmental quality in their surroundings because you have that. You have more headaches legally, you have more headaches with costs. It's not going to do any favors for you to be in the good graces of the community. And so energy companies are really smart now where they're working in concert with the people potentially that would be affected by the output of their plant. They don't want to see any environmental ruin because when you have prosperity, you should also naturally have environmental protection too, not this, extreme one way versus another overdevelopment or no development. And then you have a no net benefit to the environment because there's like fewer incentives to care. But yeah, I think it has to return to kind of small government. I just don't see how you can have a whole of government approach, including promoting abundance. I didn't see President Biden's administration do that. We saw the opposite, and we didn't see much of abundance. We saw a lot of intermittent energy elevated. So yes, we have to steer in the direction of what works. I think smaller, limited government. I know some people don't like hearing that. Some even on the right these days are a little afraid of that term, but I think conventional wisdom says you got to go with what works, and that's what works, especially for abundance.
Well, yeah, I think if it was possible to use big government to command abundance into existence, then the Soviet Union would have done that.
Yeah.
But after 70 years, they ended up with an economy about 40% the size of the United States. So maybe a commandant for abundance is not the solution.
No.
Um, so you've mentioned the attitude of some of some big companies and things like ESG, the environmental, social, and governance, where um, big companies, not just energy companies, but all sorts of, including financial companies, have tried to kind of clothe themselves in this mantle of kind of socially progressive virtue, often in ways that have been judged to be rather shallow or self-serving and kind of cynical. And uh, but this was a way that a lot of climate activists had of arguing that net zero and climate activism is for real this time. It's not just hippies in the street. It's not just environmentalists gluing their hands to things. It's some of the biggest companies in the world and the biggest money managers in the world. And if they take it seriously, well, that means we all have to take it seriously now, right? It's not just college activists. But what we've seen just even more recently, right, in the past 6 to 12 months, is a lot of companies are stepping back from that and saying, "Oh, actually, we don't want to hitch ourselves to this climate activism stuff," and have been dropping these climate and environmental pledges. So, you know, the some of these sort of like big business associations, like this thing called the Net Zero Asset Managers Alliance, and there's a group called the Climate Action 100 Plus that a bunch of companies and CEOs joined over the past few years, have been hemorrhaging members. A couple of them have just shut down because their biggest sponsors are gone. And just recently in Washington D.C., this is a week or two ago, Jamie Dimon, CEO of J.P. Morgan Chase, was here in Washington D.C. at a big public event, and someone asked him, a journalist who was interviewing, asked him about all this again, sort of frothy interest over the past few years in green investing and climate conscious stuff, and he said, he said it was so misguided and such a poor series of decisions that it would end up producing 100 Cylindras, right? For people, throwback to the taxpayer-funded solar company that famously failed during the Obama years. Um, where do you think this leaves sort of big business now if we had this huge run up from say 2020 to 2024 and all these companies trying to say how like green and climate conscious they were, and then just recently a lot of them saying actually maybe we're just going to stick to our money making business and let the activists do the environmental stuff.
I'm encouraged to see them acknowledge the vibe shift away from net zero to this reliable abundance mindset. And an associate of ours, a fellow traveler, Russ Green, wrote recently something fantastic in the Free Press talking about how the vibe shift even predates President Trump's second win. In 2022, some financial asset managers and even those who were dabbling into this had recognized that ESG, especially ESG funds, have a low return on investment. You're not really seeing a betterment of the environment. And they produce phantom credits. They invite people to kind of game the system to elevate and inflate their environmental score and their environmental output and activism. And a lot of these companies don't really do anything with the environment. They were, I believe, guilted into subscribing to this to not be shunned, to curry favor with environmentalists, and especially with the big energy corporations. Why would you sign on to a philosophy or a plan that ultimately calls for the demise of your company? By 2050, what your company, oil and gas company, would be obsolete, essentially, with them wanting to chart the decarbonization course and then put you out of business. So you're just signing away your business, but delaying your demise by 2-3 decades, give or take, buying some sort of face and reputation when ultimately you're going to be on the chopping block. The crocodile eats you last kind of principle that we often hear about. And so these companies realized, especially in recent years, that, okay, signing on to net zero sounds great. Is it really feasible, practical to do this? And does this mean ultimately that we will cease to exist if they succeed in achieving this? And obviously, everyone has recognized, a lot of people have recognized more so that even if you give like conservative deference to net zero aims and goals, how much does it cost? How much are you actually reducing temperature wise? The Heritage Foundation has done a lot of study into this. Kevin, who is a statistician with them, I always forget his name, but Kevin from Heritage
Diorama.
Foundation, yes, Diorama, and he's fantastic. And he has done a lot of modeling on this using the magic model from the federal government itself. And he found that at best, you would only see point or 2.2 degrees Celsius reduction, but you see untold levels of economic destruction. So you don't achieve the Paris Climate Accord goal of reducing or staving off the temperature increase of 1.5 degrees Celsius, but you have $7 trillion worth of destruction to the GDP. What does that do? It doesn't incentivize people to care about the environment. Obviously, and then you're imposing carbon taxes on so-called carbon intensive businesses and services. Those companies leave the United States. They go into countries where they're not taxed so much, although Europe does have a more rigorous standard, more onerous regulation. So they like to also do this even worse than we do. And we've moved away from that, thankfully. And so it's paradoxical that these companies were so bought into this, but they realize that now they don't have to. They can be unshackled from net zero and ESG because it wasn't working in the private sector. And all this posturing from the federal government, I think one of the first rules that was codified was with the 401k plan, or with ERISA, with the Department of Labor, that said that we can now consider ESG criteria into 401k investments into 401ks or money managers, how they could weigh that. And people started to see their 401ks diminish, even outside of what we've seen recently with the market reacting, obviously, to tariffs. We haven't seen as much discontinuity since then, but the depletion of people's Social Security funds, 401ks were starting to go down when this rule was implemented. The markets were not responding well to it. And then you looked purely at the investment side of things. There was a very low return on investment. A lot of different studies, several studies that we've documented at our center, have found that there's really not much of a difference between ESG funds and non-ESG funds. They actually found that, interestingly enough, the ESG funds performed even worse than the non-ESG funds. And there was no negligible improvement to the environment if these ESG investment strategies were in place. It invites a lot of phantom credits. It's very hard to quantify your emissions across your supply chain. And the Scope 3 emissions rule was so controversial. I know CEI has weighed in on this. We opposed it very fiercely. The Scope 3 emissions rule to track upstream and downstream emissions. It was impossible to do it. There's no rubric to do it. There's no technology. It takes away from the company focusing on their bottom line. It's very costly. It would burden a lot of producers, let's say in the agriculture industry, energy producers. And it was just seen as a way to put more burdens on these companies who are already highly regulated, to make them now track their emissions, which might be negligible. And then they have to have these added costs, and then it steers them away from their primary functions of delivering products and services. And it was so controversial. I remember the SEC finalized the rule and put down a watered down version, which only
Hmm.
affected a portion of producers that were carbon intensive or intensive producers and services. Still a very bad rule, still very flawed, but it was so controversial and negative in terms of the blowback they received in opposition. They put down a watered down version, and we expect, I think, the SEC, if Trump hasn't already, I think, dismantled the rule with an executive order, we will see the SEC under the new chairman possibly nix that rule. I think nix the rule, maybe have nothing in its place. I don't know if they're going to have a rule rewrite, but we don't need a rule for that regardless, in my professional opinion. And so, yeah, they see it doesn't really do anything. It's this social progressive virtue signaling. It's very costly, and it has no improvement to the environment. It's really hard to track how much the environment's going to improve, because certain corporations could game the system and say, okay, because ESG is so subjective, I
Hmm.
could say I did this. I bought indulgences, I bought credits, and then it turns out that those credits don't work, and that the financiers behind those credits are fraudulent themselves too, and they may engage in some questionable practices as it relates to the environment as well. So ESG is crumbling slowly but surely. Like I said, Russ has done a great job of spotlighting this. And we had, all of us who were opposing ESG had seen the writing on the wall. We were dismissed as fringe and crazy, and that no way that this would happen. And this, as your listeners know, stemmed from a 2019 Business Roundtable decree that said, we're not going to be prioritizing profits. We're going to focus on stakeholder capitalism and move away and be, make sure that we have like, we try to please people who don't invest with us, like the public and consumers, and do that. And when you have that practice, you ultimately see that you alienate your customer base. Your shareholders are very angry. They then have responded by passing shareholder resolutions to discourage ESG investing practices very successfully, I would say, among most of them. Some corporations are very hard to crack, but there has
Hmm.
been a lot of resistance internally now, where the shareholders have said, okay, this is not profitable. This is political. We want to move away from this. We want to focus on our bottom line. And even those who were, in support of it have changed their tune too, because they've seen so much loss of capital, so much loss of business, and they don't have that good reputation anymore. And they're trying to, restore rapport with consumers. Some corporations a little too late. I think the energy companies didn't necessarily, I would say, burn their good faith with the public. They had recognized the error of their ways, and they'll still have to do some building back up of trust with certain entities. But I would say those who were not directly in energy, like the Budweisers, Target, and some others, are going to learn the hard way that ESG, DEI, CRT posturing just doesn't work. But the energy companies stopped, I would say, in their tracks, because they probably want to get some dealings with the federal government, maybe some projects to be approved. So they said, if we don't align with the Trump administration, we probably won't benefit. So I don't know if it's a matter of convenience or if they truly changed their heart. I hope they did intentionally change, because they see that it's a flawed policy, ESG posturing, whether it's an investment or even as a political philosophy in your corporation. So we'll see if it withstands, the Trump administration. They steer back to this even beyond a Trump administration. But it's very encouraging so far, but the job is not yet done to repel ESG.
Yeah, I know. When it comes to the idea of shareholders versus stakeholders, I've always said that it's perfectly reasonable to worry about what some of your non-shareholders think about you, especially if those are your customers or your employees, right? They're both important parts of your company, but you shouldn't hand over your corporate strategy to outside activists who hate the fact that your company exists in the first place.
Correct.
That's not the stakeholder you should be prioritizing. Um, and thanks for mentioning our good friend Russ. He was our guest on the show all the way back in episode 5. So we love him. Um, well, Gabriella, we could keep going all day because you and I, we're a dynamic duo when it comes to good policy ideas. I just have to say, um, but we'll wrap it for now. I'll say thank you so much for being with us, and please tell everyone where they can find all your excellent work online.
Absolutely. Thank you, Richard. And we should revisit doing something again like this. More than happy to come on and appreciate the opportunity. But go to iwf.org/CEC to see all of our writings, our musings, that of myself and our fellows. We have a great little team. And Paige Lambermont, who is with CEI, is also one of our
Mm-hmm.
fabulous CEC fellows. So we love working with her. I'm a big fan of her work, and she helps us to deconstruct what's happening with nuclear. So that's the best way to find me. Twitter, or X, uh, x.com/Gabby underscore Hoffman. Very easy to be found and approached, and appreciate the opportunity to talk to you with what's trending in energy and conservation.
All right. Thanks again, Gabriella.
Thank you.